In the summer of 1845, the British Empire launched one of the most ambitious expeditions in history. Its mission was to discover the Northwest Passage, a sea route that explorers had searched for over centuries. If successful, it would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, changing global trade forever. To lead the mission, the Royal Navy selected Sir John Franklin, a respected Arctic explorer with decades of experience. At 59 years old, Franklin accepted what would become the final voyage of his remarkable career. Two powerful ships were chosen for the expedition, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Originally built as warships, they had been specially reinforced to survive the crushing pressure of Arctic ice. They also carried steam engines, advanced heating systems, and enough food to last for several years. The expedition included 129 officers and crew members. Scientists, engineers, surgeons, and experienced sailors all believed they were preparing for a journey that would make history. On May 19, 1845, the ships departed England. Families gathered along the waterfront to say goodbye, believing their loved ones would soon return as national heroes. No one watching that farewell could have imagined that many of these men would never be seen alive again. The greatest Arctic mystery had just begun. As HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed north, excitement filled the ships. The crew believed they were part of an expedition that would be remembered for generations. Spirits were high, and confidence was everywhere. The ship stopped briefly in Greenland to take on fresh supplies, including livestock and additional provisions for the long journey ahead. This would be the last opportunity to prepare before entering one of the harshest environments on Earth. Letters were written home, and final messages were sent to families. None of the crew knew these would become the last confirmed communications many of them would ever send. In late July 1845, two British whaling ships spotted Franklin's expedition in Baffin Bay. The crews exchanged greetings before Franklin's ships continued toward Lancaster Sound. This was the last confirmed European sighting of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. After disappearing beyond the Arctic horizon, the expedition entered a region where no official records would be created for many months. Ahead lay endless ice, unpredictable weather, and a journey that would soon become one of history's greatest mysteries. Beyond Lancaster Sound, the Arctic became quieter than anyone had imagined. Towering cliffs, drifting ice, and endless cold surrounded the expedition. Every mile forward carried the ships deeper into one of the least explored regions on Earth. The officers carefully recorded weather conditions, sea currents, and magnetic observations. These scientific records were just as important as the search for the Northwest Passage itself. Despite the harsh environment, life on board remained highly organized. Every sailor had a daily duty. Meals were served on schedule, equipment was inspected, and the ships were constantly prepared for changing ice conditions. Franklin understood that success in the Arctic depended on patience, discipline, and careful planning. Rushing forward could be disastrous. Every decision had to be made with caution. As summer slowly faded, the temperature began to fall. Thin sheets of ice started appearing on the water. For experienced Arctic explorers, it was a clear warning that winter was approaching much faster than expected. The crew still believed they had enough time to continue west. But the Arctic had its own rules, and those rules would soon begin to reshape the fate of every man on board. By the end of August 1845, Franklin's expedition reached Beechey Island, a remote and barren place in the Canadian Arctic. Here, the officers made an important decision. Instead of risking the growing sea ice, they would remain through the winter and continue their journey when conditions improved. The ships were carefully secured, and the crew immediately began preparing for the long polar winter. Supplies were organized, equipment was checked, and work parties went ashore to establish storage areas and carry out scientific observations. Life settled into a strict routine. Every day had a schedule. The men maintained the ships, recorded weather conditions, and exercised to stay healthy during the months of darkness ahead. At first, there was little reason to panic. The expedition had enough food, warm clothing, and fuel. Franklin had survived Arctic winters before, and many believed this would simply be another difficult season. But no amount of preparation could fully predict what the Arctic had in store. Hidden beneath the silence and snow, the first signs of trouble were already beginning to appear. The long winter had only just begun. As autumn faded into winter, Beechey Island became the expedition's first Arctic home. The ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, remained safely anchored while the surrounding sea slowly turned to ice. For the officers and crew, this was not an unexpected setback. Wintering in the Arctic had always been part of the plan. Every day followed a strict routine. The men cleared snow from the decks, repaired equipment, recorded weather observations, and carefully managed their supplies. Maintaining discipline was considered just as important as preserving food and fuel. Inside the ships, iron stoves provided warmth against the bitter cold outside. Lanterns lit the wooden cabins as sailors shared meals, read books, wrote journals, and tried to maintain a sense of normal life. The expedition also continued its scientific work. Weather measurements, magnetic observations, and navigational records were collected whenever conditions allowed. Even in one of the harshest environments on Earth, the mission's scientific goals remained important. At first, morale was surprisingly high. Most of the crew believed that when spring arrived, the ice would melt, the ships would sail again, and the search for the Northwest Passage would continue. But the Arctic had a way of testing even the best-prepared expeditions, and this winter was only the beginning. Each morning began with the sound of the ship's bell echoing through the frozen air. For the men aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, routine was more than discipline, it was a way to survive. Every sailor had a duty, and every task helped prepare the expedition for the months ahead. Snow was cleared from the decks before it could build into dangerous layers. Ropes, sails, and equipment were inspected daily. Below deck, engineers checked the heating systems while officers carefully monitored food supplies and fuel. Nothing could be wasted. Meals were served at regular times, usually consisting of preserved meat, biscuits, soup, and tea. The crew understood that careful rationing would be essential if the winter lasted longer than expected. Whenever the weather allowed, scientific observations continued. Temperatures were recorded, magnetic instruments were checked, and detailed notes were written into official journals. These records would become an important part of the expedition's legacy. Although the Arctic seemed peaceful, its silence was deceptive. The men could not yet see the challenges waiting ahead. Beyond the frozen horizon, the expedition's greatest test was slowly drawing closer. For now, Beechey Island remained quiet, but history was already beginning to unfold. As the weeks passed, the Arctic winter tightened its grip. Outside, temperatures continued to fall. The sea had become a solid sheet of ice, and the sun barely rose above the horizon before disappearing again. Daylight grew shorter, and darkness became a constant companion. Inside the ships, life continued according to schedule. Officers inspected every corner of the vessels, while the crew repaired equipment, cleaned living quarters, and prepared for whatever the Arctic might bring next. Staying busy helped keep both the ships and the men's spirits alive. The expedition's surgeon also found himself with more responsibilities. A few sailors began complaining of fatigue, persistent coughs, and weakness. At first, these symptoms did not seem unusual. After all, months of extreme cold, isolation, and hard work could affect even the strongest men. No one believed the situation was becoming dangerous. The officers remained confident that warmer weather would eventually break the ice and allow the expedition to continue westward. But history would prove otherwise. The first signs of trouble had already appeared, even if no one on board fully understood what they meant. The Arctic was patient, and it never hurried. By the beginning of January 1846, the mood aboard the expedition had quietly begun to change. What had once seemed like an ordinary Arctic winter was becoming something far more difficult. A few members of the crew were growing seriously ill. One of them was leading stoker John Torrington, a young sailor who had helped maintain the ship's steam engines. Historical records confirm that his health declined during the first winter, though the exact cause of his illness remains unknown. The expedition's surgeon did everything he could. Warm shelter, careful observation, and the best medical knowledge of the time were all available. But medicine in the mid-19th century had severe limits, especially in the isolation of the Arctic. On January 1, 1846, John Torrington died at just 20 years of age. He became the first member of Franklin's expedition to lose his life. His fellow sailors buried him on Beechey Island with full Royal Navy honors. A simple wooden marker was placed above his grave, overlooking the frozen landscape. More than a century later, Torrington's grave would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Arctic history, helping researchers learn more about the expedition than Franklin's crew could ever have imagined. But in 1846, the surviving crew believed this was only a tragic beginning, not a warning of what was still to come. The loss of John Torrington weighed heavily on the expedition. His grave stood alone in the frozen ground of Beechey Island, a quiet reminder that even the best-equipped Arctic expedition was vulnerable to forces beyond its control. As the winter continued, more members of the crew began showing signs of illness. The expedition's surgeon worked tirelessly, but life in the high Arctic offered few medical options. Isolation, extreme cold, and months without fresh food placed enormous strain on every man aboard. On January 3, 1846, Royal Marine William Braine died. Just a few days later, on January 4, able seaman John Hartnell also lost his life. Historical records confirm their deaths, but the exact medical causes remain uncertain. The two men were buried beside John Torrington on Beechey Island. 3 simple graves now overlooked the frozen coastline, standing in silent witness to the expedition's first terrible winter. Despite these heartbreaking losses, the surviving officers and crew refused to give up. They believed that when spring arrived, the ice would finally break, the ships would sail again, and the mission could still succeed. But the Arctic had already begun writing a very different ending, one that none of them could yet see.
As spring slowly returned to the Arctic, the endless darkness finally began to fade. Sunlight touched the frozen landscape once again, bringing a renewed sense of hope to the men aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Months had passed since the expedition arrived at Beechey Island. 3 of their companions now rested beneath the snow, but the mission itself was still alive. The officers believed the worst of the winter was finally behind them. The crew immediately began preparing the ships for departure. Ropes were inspected, sails were repaired, navigation instruments were checked, and every supply was counted. If the sea ice opened, they wanted to be ready without delay. Before leaving, many of the officers paused one final time at the 3 graves overlooking the silent Arctic shore. There were no speeches, no celebrations, only quiet respect for the men they had lost. Soon afterward, the expedition turned west, leaving Beechey Island behind. The Northwest Passage still seemed possible, and confidence slowly returned to the ships. None of the crew realized they were sailing toward the most dangerous chapter of the entire expedition. Beyond the horizon, the Arctic was waiting once again. By the summer of 1846, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had left Beechey Island far behind. Their course now led deeper into the Canadian Arctic, through waters that few Europeans had ever explored. Every mile forward brought the expedition closer to its goal, and closer to disaster. For a short time, conditions appeared favorable. Open channels of water allowed the ships to make steady progress. The officers believed they were finally approaching the last unexplored section of the Northwest Passage. But in the Arctic, everything could change within days. As autumn approached, drifting sea ice began closing around the ships. At first, no one seemed alarmed. Experienced officers had seen moving ice before, and they expected it to break apart. Instead, the ice kept growing thicker. Narrow passages disappeared one after another. The ship slowed, then almost stopped. According to the Victory Point note, by September 1846, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror became trapped in the pack ice northwest of King William Island. It was a moment that would shape everything that followed. The men believed it was only a temporary delay. None of them knew they would never sail these ships freely again. At first, the situation did not seem hopeless. Arctic expeditions often became trapped in sea ice for weeks or even months. Franklin's officers believed that when warmer weather returned, the ice would break apart and the voyage could continue. Life aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror settled into another familiar routine. Every morning, the crew inspected the hulls, measured the movement of the ice, and searched for any sign of open water. Day after day, the answer remained the same. The officers updated their charts and journals with remarkable precision. Every change in the weather, every shift in the ice, and every important decision was carefully recorded. Those records would later become some of the most valuable clues left behind by the expedition. Below deck, engineers maintained the steam engines, while the surgeon continued caring for the crew. Food supplies were checked regularly, and strict rationing ensured that nothing was wasted. The men still believed they had enough resources to survive another winter if necessary. But outside, the Arctic remained silent. The ice showed no sign of releasing its grip. With each passing day, hope depended less on the ships and more on the unpredictable forces of nature. The expedition had prepared for the Arctic. What no one could prepare for was how long the Arctic intended to keep them. As another Arctic winter settled over the frozen sea, time itself seemed to slow down. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. Beyond the wooden walls of the ships, there was nothing but endless snow, drifting ice, and a silence unlike anywhere else on Earth. To keep morale from collapsing, the officers insisted on routine. Every morning began with assigned duties. Sailors cleaned the decks, repaired equipment, and inspected every part of the ships. The work was repetitive, but it gave the men purpose. Below deck, the atmosphere was warmer, but uncertainty was growing. Meals were carefully rationed. Conversations often turned to home, to families waiting in Britain, and to the hope that the coming spring would finally free the expedition. The expedition's scientists continued recording weather patterns, magnetic readings, and ice conditions whenever possible. Even in isolation, they remained committed to the mission that had brought them into the Arctic. No one aboard could know that these ordinary routines would soon be interrupted by extraordinary events. The greatest challenge facing the expedition was no longer the search for the Northwest Passage. It was survival. And with every passing day, the Arctic seemed determined to test them a little more. By the spring of 1847, the expedition had been trapped in the Arctic for many months. The optimism that once filled the ships was slowly giving way to uncertainty. Every passing week reminded the crew that rescue was becoming less and less likely. Sir John Franklin continued to lead with the same calm determination that had earned him the respect of his officers and sailors. Even as conditions grew more difficult, he remained focused on maintaining order, discipline, and hope. But history records a turning point that changed everything. According to the Victory Point note, Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847. The document tells us when he died, but not why. Nearly 2 centuries later, historians still cannot say with certainty what caused his death. His passing left the expedition without the man who had inspired the mission from the very beginning. Leadership now fell to Captain Francis Crozier and Commander James Fitzjames, 2 experienced officers who faced an impossible challenge. The ships were still locked in the Arctic ice. The mission was no longer simply about discovering the Northwest Passage. It had become a struggle to keep 128 surviving men alive. The greatest test of the Franklin expedition was only beginning. For nearly a year after Sir John Franklin's death, the expedition remained trapped in the ice. Captain Francis Crozier and Commander James Fitzjames continued leading the surviving crew, hoping that the Arctic would eventually release the ships. But the ice never did. By April of 1848, the situation had become critical. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had now been imprisoned in the ice for more than 19 months. Supplies were dwindling, and the men faced a decision that no Royal Navy expedition ever wanted to make. On April 25, 1848, Captain Crozier and Commander Fitzjames wrote a brief message on a printed Admiralty form. Today, it is known as the Victory Point Note. The note recorded several crucial facts. It confirmed that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. It also stated that the ships had remained trapped since September 1846. Most importantly, it revealed that 105 officers and men were preparing to abandon HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The plan was bold and desperate. The survivors would leave the safety of their ships and begin a long journey south across the frozen Arctic, hoping to reach the Back River and eventually rescue. It was a decision that would become one of the most famous and most heartbreaking in the history of polar exploration. In late April of 1848, the order was finally given. After nearly 2 years trapped in the Arctic, the survivors stepped off HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. For many of them, it was the last time they would ever stand on the decks of the ships they had called home. The men pulled heavy sledges loaded with food, boats, weapons, navigation instruments, and other essential supplies. Every pound mattered, but leaving too much behind could mean certain death. Every decision carried enormous risk. Their destination was the Back River, hundreds of miles to the south. If they could reach it, they hoped it might eventually lead them toward safety and contact with the outside world. The journey would test every limit of human endurance. The Arctic offered no roads, no shelter, and no guarantee of survival. Only endless ice, freezing winds, and an unforgiving landscape stretched before them. Today, archaeologists have discovered scattered artifacts left behind along parts of this route, silent evidence that the men continued moving south, even under unimaginable conditions. With every step away from the ships, the expedition left behind not only HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, but also its last certainty. The farther the survivors traveled, the more difficult the journey became. Each day demanded extraordinary strength. Heavy sledges had to be pulled across uneven sea ice, frozen ridges, and deep snow. Progress was painfully slow. The Arctic gave them no easy path. Powerful winds swept across the open ice, while temperatures remained well below freezing. Every mile required determination, teamwork, and the hope that rescue might still be possible. As the weeks passed, exhaustion became impossible to ignore. The men had already endured years of isolation aboard the trapped ships. Now they faced the even greater challenge of crossing one of the harshest environments on Earth entirely on foot. Modern archaeological discoveries suggest that equipment and personal belongings were left behind along parts of the route. These objects tell us that the survivors were forced to make difficult choices about what they could continue carrying. Inuit oral histories, recorded many years later, also describe groups of exhausted European explorers moving across the Arctic. While every detail cannot be independently confirmed, these accounts have helped researchers better understand the expedition's final journey. With every step south, hope remained alive, but the Arctic continued to demand an unimaginable price. Years passed, but no one in Britain knew what had become of Franklin's expedition. The silence from the Arctic grew more troubling with every passing season. Families waited for letters that never arrived, and hope slowly began to fade. When the expedition failed to return, the British Admiralty launched one search mission after another. Dozens of ships entered the Arctic, determined to discover the fate of Sir John Franklin and his men. These rescue expeditions searched thousands of miles of frozen coastline, islands, and waterways. They found campsites, scattered equipment, and a few written clues, but the full story remained hidden beneath the Arctic ice. Along the way, searchers spoke with Inuit hunters who described encounters with exhausted European sailors many years earlier. These accounts became some of the most valuable clues available to investigators. At first, some officials questioned those stories, but as more evidence was uncovered over the following decades, many details from the Inuit accounts proved remarkably consistent with archaeological discoveries. The mystery was no longer just about a missing expedition. It had become one of the greatest historical investigations ever undertaken in the Arctic. By 1859, nearly 14 years had passed since Sir John Franklin's expedition had sailed into the Arctic. Many believed the mystery would never be solved, yet one determined search expedition refused to give up. Led by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock, the expedition carefully searched the western coast of King William Island. Every abandoned campsite, every weathered stone marker, and every forgotten object was examined with extraordinary care. Then came the discovery that would change the investigation forever. Inside a stone cairn at Victory Point, the search team found a printed Admiralty form. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. but handwritten notes added around its margins revealed the first official account of what had happened to Franklin's expedition. The message confirmed that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. It also revealed that HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had remained trapped in the ice since September 1846. Most importantly, the note recorded that 105 survivors had abandoned the ships in April of 1848 under the leadership of Captain Francis Crozier. For the first time, the world finally had direct evidence from the expedition itself, but even this remarkable document answered only a few questions, while creating many more. For more than a century and a half, the Arctic guarded its secrets. Countless expeditions searched for HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, but the ships seemed to have vanished without a trace beneath the ice. Everything changed in September 2014. After years of planning and searching, a Canadian expedition made a remarkable discovery. Deep beneath the cold waters of the Arctic, the wreck of HMS Erebus was finally found. The discovery confirmed that at least one of Franklin's ships had survived far longer than many historians once believed. It also opened an entirely new chapter in the investigation. Just 2 years later, in September 2016, another extraordinary breakthrough followed. This time, researchers located HMS Terror resting on the seabed in remarkably well-preserved condition. The cold Arctic water had protected both ships for generations. Cabins, equipment, and countless artifacts remained hidden inside, waiting for modern technology to reveal their stories. Each new discovery brought historians closer to understanding the fate of Franklin's expedition. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The greatest Arctic mystery has not been completely solved, but it is no longer completely hidden. The Franklin expedition did not simply disappear into the Arctic. Instead, it became one of history's greatest lessons about courage, ambition, and the limits of human endurance. What began as a mission to discover a new sea route ended as a mystery that would challenge generations of explorers and scientists. Over the decades, every discovery added another small piece to the puzzle: a weathered campsite, a forgotten tool, a handwritten note, a ship resting beneath the icy waters. Together, these fragments slowly revealed a story that had remained hidden for more than a century. Yet many questions still have no answers. What happened during the expedition's final weeks? How far did the survivors travel? What decisions did they make as hope faded? The Arctic has never revealed every secret. Today, historians continue to study new evidence using advanced technology, underwater archaeology, and forensic science. Each expedition into the Arctic brings the possibility of another remarkable discovery. Franklin's story reminds us that history is never truly finished. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries continue to evolve long after the people who live them are gone. And somewhere beneath the Arctic sky, the silence still keeps a few secrets of its own. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Sir John Franklin and his crew disappeared into the Arctic. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet their story continues to inspire explorers, historians, and scientists across the globe. The Franklin expedition was more than a failed voyage. It became a symbol of human curiosity, determination, and the relentless desire to explore the unknown. Even in the face of impossible odds, these men pushed farther into the Arctic than almost anyone before them. Modern discoveries have answered many important questions, but they have also reminded us that history is rarely complete. Every artifact recovered from the Arctic adds another piece to the puzzle, while leaving room for new mysteries to emerge. Perhaps that is why the Franklin expedition continues to captivate us. It is not only a story about ships trapped in ice. It is a story about hope, leadership, sacrifice, and the enduring human spirit. The frozen waters of the Canadian Arctic still guard many secrets. Beneath the silence, beneath the ice, fragments of the past continue to wait for those willing to search. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next chapter, where we continue exploring the world's most fascinating true stories. Until next time, history is never truly silent.